your faith community is the ideal place to practice these skills.
That's great.
Like, are your houses of worship not spaces for grace? Where people can make mistakes. They show up imperfect. I think that's what the church has always said, right? The church isn't there for perfect people. It's for sinful people, right? People struggling, people who are in need, people who need help.
Well, I am pretty darned excited about this, just being able to sit down with you, Ray. This is Ray Kim, who has become a friend. And so we've done some things together, spent some time together, walked together a little bit. So I know a little bit about you, but I'm sure I'm going to find out a lot more today, which is always one of the benefits of doing these interviews is we get a chance to go a little deeper into things. Ray is a program director for the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. Yeah. It was just a word I never used for anything. I mean, I never used the
mouthful as well. It's hard.
And how long have you been doing that?
So I've been
with that organization.
Yeah, I've been with ICRD. We can just go by ICRD, right?
Thank you.
So you've explained what the acronym stands for. So I've been with the organization since April of 2021. So I joined during the pandemic. So what is that now? Like three and a half years now,
right?
Coming up. So I've been with them for a good long while now, I guess.
How long had they existed before you got together with them?
Yeah, they have officially existed since 1998. So it's been a while. So they've been doing a lot of really good work, primarily around the world.
Yeah.
ICRD got its first kind of feet on the ground kind of work doing programming in Pakistan.
Yeah.
And this was before 9/11.
Wow.
Right. And our founder, and who was also, I guess, former CEO and president at one point, right? The first CEO and president, Doug Johnston, he had friends in Pakistan, and being a career kind of diplomat himself, he was also in the military, served in the Navy. He had friends who reached out to him and said, like, hey, like, we're hearing things that are kind of weird, like in our madrasas, right, in our Islamic schools, right? The youth are tapping into things that, like, we have no idea where this is coming from.
Wow.
This is pre-9/11.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, those are the kind of nascent roots of the Taliban, right?
Whoa.
And so,
what a birthplace for an organization.
Yeah.
Right in the middle of all that.
And he was invited to kind of come and, like, help the imams there figure out what this is and how to kind of, I guess, what we currently call prevent radicalization or preventing violent extremism, right? And so a lot of our programming in the beginning was working alongside concerned imams and Muslim leaders to kind of correct this and nip it in the bud before it grew. But unfortunately, there's just one organization doing that work. You're not going to get very far.
He must have been extraordinarily surprised by how fast it grew and how deep it went.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, let's back up a little bit, and let's start with where you came from. You ended up at Georgetown, but how did you get there first, and then what you did at Georgetown, where your focus was, and how you ended up at the organization you're with now?
Sure. I'll trace it backwards, and then I'll kind of start from there again,
okay.
Right? So before Georgetown, I got to Georgetown University in 2015 to start my Ph.D. program in theological and religious studies. It's a joint department. I am more of a specialist in the sociology of religion side of it, so that would be the religious studies part of the department. And before I started my Ph.D. program, I was living in Jordan for 2 years, so 2013 to 2015, right after I graduated college from Boston College as an undergrad. In Jordan, I initially went out there because, this was peak of the kind of refugee crisis, right? This was post-Arab Spring, Syrian civil war was kind of erupting right around the same time. So many countries were ailing at the time. Somalia, we had a huge influx of Somali refugees in Jordan. We had a huge influx of Sudanese refugees in Jordan. We had a huge influx of Syrian refugees in Jordan, not to mention the Iraqi refugees who were coming in even before then.
Yeah.
So everybody in that region who needed a new place, a safe place to be, was calling Jordan home pretty much.
Yeah.
And I saw that, living here in the US, and I was like, I kind of want to go help. Right. And I studied abroad in Jordan in 2011. And so I kind of had some familiarity, but I was like, I have no idea how to actually go there and help. And fortunately, a professor of mine in my senior year, she was kind enough to ask, like, hey, what do you want to do after you graduate? And I was like, I have this crazy idea. I just want to go to Jordan and I'm going to try to see if I can help. And she was like, let me put you in touch with some folks so that you're not just kind of going there blind. And I connected with the Jesuit Refugee Services initially.
Yeah.
And they, at the time they were so swamped, right? Resources were thin, and they were like, look, to be frank, we don't have a paid position here yet, but if you maybe wait around October, November, maybe something may turn up. And I was like, okay, well, and this was in August. I was like, okay, that's like 2-3 months. I'm still going to need to figure out a way to like live here and pay rent and stuff like that, right? And so I was like, do you mind if I work somewhere else? And I volunteer part-time. They're like, we don't care what you do, or when you do it, we appreciate the help. You do you, right? Yeah. And so I ended up actually very lucky. I was just at a cafe hanging out with some friends who were there on a Fulbright scholarship.
Yeah.
And 2 tables down from this long table, a woman sits down who eventually becomes one of my good friends, Amanda. She goes, oh my God, we just had to fire another social studies teacher. And I'm like, that sounds like a desperation. And I was like, I could be your social studies teacher. Yeah. And I was like, she's like, have you taught before? And I have some experience teaching like private academies, tutors and things like that. Yeah. And she was like, send me your resume and then we'll talk later. I sent it to her. I didn't really expect much, but then literally the day after, I get a phone call in the morning, like 8:30 in the morning, and I'm like, I'm still asleep because, I'm unemployed at the time, living in Jordan, couch surfing. And I'm like, hello. And she's like, yeah, this is the Modern American School. I was like, oh, yeah, hello, yes. And they're like, can you come in today for an interview? I'm like, yeah, I can be there. Just give me like 2 p.m. They're like, great. I go in, do the interview. They're like, can you start tomorrow? I'm like, whoa, you just gave me the books. I need at least a weekend to look it over. And and the rest is history. I was their middle school social studies teacher as well as their high school MUN director by the second year. And that was just chance.
What is inside of you that drives you to leave home and go to Jordan?
Yeah.
It sounds like adventurous, obviously. Yeah. But you're a student.
Yeah.
Were you just bored with school and wanted some adventure?
No, so there was some discernment, and I thought long and hard about it. In my last year of Boston College, I was technically enrolled in a 5-year BA/MA program. So the deal is, instead of doing 2 whole years to get your master's degree after your undergraduate, your BA is done, I would start taking master's level courses in my senior year so that I'm ahead in credits, and then I just stay 1 more year, right? So it's like you save some time and you save some money.
Yeah.
And as I was contemplating and trying to discern, like, okay, do I really, want to do this? Do I want to do something different? And for some reason, a lot of my professors were just like, Ray, you can always get an MA. Go see the world.
Whoa.
Yeah, and I'm like, interested, like,
yeah.
And I was like, wait, do you guys not want me here? Or like, is this?
Do you see something I don't see?
Oh, wait. No. And they're like, no. We love you. We want you here. We'll welcome you back if you really do commit to coming back. But they're like, you have your early 20s only once in your life.
That's so
you can
cool.
always get your master's. Yeah. You can get your master's in your mid-20s, your late 20s. You can try something, realize it didn't work out, come back, get your master's, not too late. And so they really encouraged me to just kind of forego that 5th year and kind of take a leap of faith. And I prayed long and hard about that. People thought, I was like, dude, you're crazy. Like you have nothing set up when you go. I'm like, I know, I'm just going to couch surf for a little bit, find a place, get a job. I'll wait tables. I'll clean dishes, cars, whatever it takes. I think I just had it in. I was just like, I want to do something on my own.
Yeah.
Like with no, and it isn't with no safety net, right? I think my mom, my parents were still there. My mom was still in LA. my grandma's still alive and everything. And so if it didn't pan out in like 3 to 4 months, I knew I could come back to LA at the time. That's where my mom was, and figure it out and do the conventional like 9 to 5, get a 9 to 5 and figure it out stuff. So yeah, I think I knew this was one opportunity, and I didn't know how many more of these opportunities I was going to get. And I just kind of seized it and went with it. And I said,
cool opportunity to just jump into cross-cultural life.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. A lot of learning.
Did it go well?
I loved my life in Jordan. I would have stayed longer in the region if the PhD thing didn't pan out. I would have kept continuing to do the international teaching circuit. I had some friends, you know, like who moved to, let's say, Nigeria, who moved to Southeast Asia, who moved to other parts of the Middle East, like they get recruited. And sometimes they give you some really swanky deals. Like they'll provide you the apartment sometimes if these are private schools, right? Sometimes they'll even give you a car if they're like, let's say Dubai. Like, oh man, Dubai, like, oh, they'll just set you up. They give you a car, your apartment, a whole shebang, right? And the salary is really good. And I have a lot of friends who ended up in Saudi Arabia also, which is not a bad deal. You live on a compound with other like foreigners and stuff. And, you know, I think if you're a woman, it's kind of harder, restrictive travel, things like that. It's gotten better in these last few years for sure. But, you know, at the time, you know, still a lot of kind of constraints. But you're saving so much money. Like you're not spending anything when you're there. And so these kind of gigs, there were a few where we knew we were just like, you just swallow the pill, do it for 2 years, and you walk out with no debt. You know,
and so, what a great experience.
What a great experience. And so I was totally happy. You know, I had other job offers at the time, you know, from other schools in Jordan to go on for my third year if the PhD thing didn't pan out. But fortunately, I got in, and it was just a matter of writing out my second year contract and moving back to the U.S.
And you ended up at Georgetown getting a PhD. Was that what you thought it was going to be?
Yes.
Any surprises there?
Oh yeah. I mean, you learn so much going through a PhD program, just kind of what it takes and the toll that it takes personally, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And I like, you know, we all like to joke, all my, you know, cohort friends and, you know, people in the program, my friends in other programs, we like to say like no one comes out unscathed, you know, like we're all dysfunctional. You go in with no mental health issues, you'll come out with at least 5, you know, so it is one of those grueling processes. But I loved it. I think I had the great fortune of meeting some of my best friends through that program. And I've done some really meaningful things with those people, with other friends in other PhD programs and other departments at the university. You know, we, for example, helped start the Graduate Workers Labor Union. So we unionized our graduate researchers and TAs and stuff like that. Like while I was there, and I was like, you know what, if I may not be able to finish my PhD program and I may not get the degree, but at least I'm leaving something behind, you know, that I thought was like truly meaningful. Cool. So yeah, I love it.
And you met your wife there, didn't you?
Yeah. So I met my wife during my dissertation work in Korea. So although, yes,
she wasn't on the exam board, was she?
No.
By the way,
no. It was just, I don't know, like fate, call it what you will. But, you know, I took 9 months, you know, whole academic year, right, in 2018 to 2019, I'm going to say. Yeah, 2018 to 2019 to spend in Korea doing field work. My dissertation topic required kind of a ethnographic or on the ground kind of observation component to this. And so I had to be in Korea. And we met at the tail end of that and, you know, just randomly at a party. And, you know, this was, I think like Tinder and stuff was like really taking off. And you know, I was in a long-term relationship before then, and then getting into this new relationship, like I was like totally like, oh, I feel very awkward. But I did it the old school way. Approach somebody physically and, you know, ask her out. And and then the rest is history. And, you know, fortunately.
Did she know what she was getting into?
Probably not.
Was she, or
No,
did she
no,
get
no.
just like baffled by
Definitely
your
not.
beauty? And then
No. She was honest, and she's like, she thought I was a novelty, kind of, like Korean American, in Korea, studying Islam, Christianity, all that, lived in the Middle East. She's like, you're such a weird guy. And she's like, I thought at least I'd have really interesting conversations with you. And I was like, oh, I'm glad I didn't disappoint you on,
That's awesome.
Yeah. So.
So I want to skip ahead a little bit because just a time, but you did, you pulled together a workshop with some Christian leaders in the Portland area. And you and Ryan Nakade were working together on this project, and Ryan is my connection with you. Yes. Ryan and I work with a group in Portland called Cure PNW, area in the Northwest. And he told me about this thing that you guys did, this workshop you did. I had never heard of anybody doing anything like this. So I had just started City Serve. I'd come out of pastoring for a long-term thing at Evangel, 31 years. And so I had spent a lot of time trying to pursue unity in a community.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work, and there's a lot of, people think they're a lot more unified than they really are. Sure. There's a lot of kind of like delusion about unity. I think unity is a really difficult thing to walk out in everyday life, and it requires so much that most people aren't usually willing to pay the price for it. So, but there was something going on with this gathering that really caught my attention. It was organic, and it was honest, and it was real. It was happening. And so maybe you could just kind of talk about that a little bit, where the impetus for that gathering came from and how it worked for you and what you think the takeaways and fruit of it were.
Yeah. So, man, our work with faith leaders in the Portland and Tri-County area started back in 2022, right? And it was also kind of a shot in the dark where January 6, 2021 happens. Our organization's like, whoa, maybe there are some things that we've learned doing our international work that could be brought to bear in our own backyard.
Yeah.
For kind of a couple of reasons. One being our international partners were seeing what was happening and transpiring in our country you can say like 2016, 2014 onwards, and they were getting increasingly concerned. And an organization going around the world touting itself to be like, yeah, we're trying to prevent violence, we're trying to address radicalization towards violent extremism, X, Y, and Z. And yet when our own country is putting out into the world this very terrible example of like what, our friends around the world are like, are you guys okay? Like,
Yeah.
I think we're fine. I think, like maybe you have a little bit of work back home. And we're like, touche. No, absolutely, you're right. Like we're so focused around like trying to solve the problems of everyone else's kind of ills. And we're like, oh man, like we've kind of overlooked our own perhaps.
Yeah.
And so we started to kind of take the same approach that we did internationally, which is we're not a religious-based organization. We're not a faith-based organization, even though there's religion in the name of our organization. But we work exclusively with faith actors because we believe that faith actors, faith communities, faith leaders have a unique set of skills, assets, and I think a role to play in society.
They're anchored to something.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so we're like, let's leverage those assets towards building peace, right? And creating bulwarks against radicalization and violence, right? And so that's our niche, right? And so we're like, okay, let's take the same approach domestically. Who are these trusted faith leaders who have a voice, who have good standing, who have great rapport with their community, and who can kind of be a moral guide, perhaps, and the catalyst for really amazing change, right?
Yeah.
And so we did a scouring of the internet just to see who's talking about January 6th, this and that. We didn't want people who seemed overly partisan, right? Because you're going to find faith leaders who are like very explicitly partisan and commenting from a more political angle. But we found a handful of folks that in our initial search were, I think, saying like really insightful things with integrity. And so we reached out to a pastor named Rick McKinley, who was the founding pastor of Imago Dei Christian Community.
Great guy.
Yeah. And
Now, is this before the riots in Portland?
No,
When Portland got on the map internationally?
After.
So this was after the riots. So all the spiritual leaders in Portland were really impacted by that event. I mean, it had a lot of international attention, but back at home, we were watching the Portland downtown area be destroyed. And it really hurt the heart. I'm sure Rick's heart was broken by it all because he'd spent so much time trying to bring the best things out of the Portland area.
And I mean, unfortunately, he wasn't the only one in the Portland area who felt that way, you know, like who felt like, oh man, like we may have dropped the ball and we need to be better. We need to do better. And so, you know, we found a few things like in an interview with Rick and cold email, send it to him. I was like, hey, loved what you said. Would love to sit down and explore perhaps a partnership and collaboration. He got back to it. He responded. And it was, you know, like, it's such
you never think that's going to happen.
And he did. And then it just grew into this beautiful personal relationship that became a working relationship. Once our organization, you know, was able to acquire funding to kind of help support our kind of efforts in the Portland area. And that's when, you know, we doubled back to Rick and like, hey, I think we have the capacity now to like do some programs, do some activities and stuff like that. Can you find friends or other faith leaders who have this same heart, who feel ready to jump into this kind of work? And he did. And then we formed this core team of pastors after kind of like a focus group discussion of, I think like 2021 or so. But then, as you know, churches are busy. You know, and
I know how difficult it is to pull pastors together for anything. And yet Rick was kind of like an apostolic leader in the Portland area. He had taken responsibility for the city. This is my city. I'm going to care for it. And that tends to push you up into the front when it comes to leadership in a local area. So but it's really hard to get spiritual leaders to make time.
So of the original 20 who showed up for the focus group discussion, we only ended up with like 5, right? Because like they all had this heart, but they're like, my church is currently not in the place right now that we can do this. We're going through a transition in our own church. Oh, we're moving buildings. Oh, we're in the middle of a lead pastor switch. Like 100 million reasons for why a church can't initially get involved at that time. But fortunately, the 5 who ended up committing, right? Tim Osborne, who was with Mosaic, Andy Mahoney at Riversgate, Chris Yarko, who oversees Willamette Christian Church Network, John Rosensteel, who was at New Hope, who New Hope eventually became a part of the Willamette Christian Church Network, right? And Rick McKinley, right? And so we became kind of this core team that was like, okay, how do we organize opportunities for discipleship? And that was, I think, fundamental.
Why do you use the word discipleship? That's interesting.
They our early conversations, I think, just kind of ended up there, where it was like the issue they saw, at least through their eyes as faith leaders, right, was this was a failure in discipleship. Right? Like the fact that their churches became so divided, that divisiveness crept in, that people in their perception were like, had these political idols, right? That was a failure in discipleship. The fact that their communities they thought were durable, could withstand tremors and kind of shakes and, you know, tension, fell apart. And they were like, wow, we didn't know this our communities are so fragile. And they're like, this fragility is because of a failure in discipleship. And so they took really like kind of an onus on themselves. They're like, yeah, like this, we dropped the ball. Like if we didn't, we wouldn't be in this situation. We wouldn't have seen what we have seen, right? And so I was like astounded by that level of like humility, of like accountability, responsibility, and just dedication to their people. And I was like, oh, I'm blessed to like be working alongside you guys. Like you guys are leaders, like through and through.
Yeah.
They didn't like deflect blame on this or that. No, they're like, no, the buck stops with us.
Yeah.
And so we have to figure out how to do
That's
better.
so cool.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. I agree with you. It's hard to find that kind of honesty and vulnerability in leadership, because the nature of the church in a local area has this underlying competitiveness that's hard to shake. You know, it's hard when you realize that anybody can walk into your church, but you really hope they don't walk out and go to another one. And so to get leaders who will be honest at that point and talk about how it really feels and where they're really at. They've just come out of a pandemic. Mm-hmm. They've just come out of 100 days of riots.
Wildfires.
Oh,
yeah.
It's just
crazy.
Like, they've been traumatized.
Yes.
The whole church is traumatized at that point. Yes. And then you and the group, the focus group, pull together members of these different churches.
Yep. And then the core team just kind of became the seed that kept on growing.
Yeah.
And, we started to strategize within the core team of like, hey, what kind of opportunities do we need to create for your co-leaders, essentially? Like, because as you know, a pastor can only do so much.
Right.
They need a team of people who will help carry water with them, right? And so we were very clear from the beginning. We're not asking you 5 to now suddenly change the terrain here by yourself. No, we're asking you to create spaces and invite others into this work so that we can create essentially a party, right, that looks so much more fun and looks so much more enticing than any other thing that's going on, essentially. And so you
didn't have much competition. There wasn't much out there.
So, we were clear on anchoring everything that we do on the immediate concerns that they had around like the fragility of their communities and how do we make it more durable? How do we help our church members kind of foster a different posture, right, of being Christian, right, and showing up in different spaces, right? As well as like, how do you navigate disagreements that happen within your own church, right? So all these things were the immediate concerns, and we just kind of dove right in and said like, all right, initially let's do a retreat where it's a smaller group of like 40 people, of people who you trust, who you feel like right now, like you want to recruit them into this work, right?
Yeah.
So we got the buy-in of that 40 through that retreat. Those 40 were like, yes, we're going to help our pastor lead the way at our churches. We're like, great, now you have your own little like battle buddies, right? And then it became inviting all of them to start thinking about like, what do you think your broader church needs, right, in all your different locations? And so we did a strategy session around that over a couple of months, and then we came to putting on another event called Unfractured, right, for Leadership Summit back in June. And then we have another one coming up in October 3rd.
Yeah.
Right. And so those two things came about very organically where there was, obviously, we're in election season now. And so there is a sense of urgency around like, we need to help prepare a congregation for whatever tremor and tension may happen due to just our very unhealthy political climate right now. And so we're like, okay, I bet that your churches are not the only ones wrestling with this. And so they're like, absolutely not. We want to make this an event for the broader Tri-County area. And so they made an open invite to
the Unfractured event.
Yes.
Yeah, I was there. It was really remarkable.
140 people showed up from 39 different churches and organizations. Right. So we were just like, oh man, like people really wanted this, need this. And so after the first one, we're like, we need to do a second one. Yeah. And so we're, that's what we've been in the works of and planning in the background. But yeah, all these things, like is because I think for a long time, the church in America took for granted a lot of stuff. Yeah. Right. And I think because it was easy, we just fell out of practice on some very core fundamental skills, like how to navigate disagreements, right? I think
You're so kind, right?
I mean,
We just did not work at it hardly at all.
Yeah.
When things got rough, we bailed and went to another church.
Sure. Yeah.
It's just like, it's what you were doing was commending these leaders for being resilient, which is really, I think it's probably hard to get the message out that this actually happened in the Portland area, but I bet most of Portland doesn't even know that it exists.
Sure.
And unless they went to the Unfractured event, and even at that event, there wasn't much touted about how you got there.
Yeah.
But this journey is a really interesting journey.
Yeah.
Somebody should write a book about this.
You?
No.
Yeah, I mean, like, and then learning the kind of Christian landscape in Portland has also been interesting for me as a sociologist of religion, right? And that there are pockets, right? There's like a Catholic pocket, there's mainline Protestant pocket, and then there's like the non-denominational and some denominational evangelical pockets, and they don't necessarily all know each other.
No.
And sometimes they perceive each other with a certain level of suspicion and skepticism. And I think largely due to just allowing assumptions about one another to kind of take root and let grow and not ever confirm or check.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that we always emphasize in our workshops and stuff is like this othering pattern that we're seeing in our society, right? Where you can listen to someone say one thing and then you fixate on a word that they said, and then you start making a list of like, oh, this person's probably progressive, liberal, snowflake, like, probably has a rainbow all over their car, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Right. And then you hear another person say one thing, and then in someone else's mind, they're like, this guy's a bigot, misogynist, blah, blah, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that's such an unhealthy habit that we've allowed to kind of form in our society.
Do you think you can get rid of those kind of habits?
I think
Is it possible?
Yeah. If you can learn it, you can definitely unlearn it, right? It's harder to unlearn, way harder to unlearn and deprogram some of these things, because I do believe it's going to require, to some extent, a cultural and societal shift, right? Because you're constantly going to be battling then some of these larger incentives to do that, right? To enforce these negative kind of behaviors, right? But how do you then kind of stay true and to what is good and what you should be doing, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think there's many opportunities for that to be demonstrated and to be lived out and practiced. And this is exactly why I tell faith leaders, right? Not just Christian faith leaders, but then like Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, any faith leader, like your faith community is the ideal place to practice these skills.
That's great.
Like, are your houses of worship not spaces for grace, where people can make mistakes? They show up imperfect. I think that's what the church has always said, right? The church isn't there for perfect people. It's for sinful people, right? People struggling, people who are in need, people who need help. When did the church become a place where you have to perform perfection, right? And where we judge and castigate and cast out people who, quote unquote, violated a norm or said the wrong thing or raised the wrong question. And I think we were seeing that happen, right? It wasn't like being enforced, but sometimes it's just these kind of passive aggressive comments or being frozen out of certain things, right? That would lead people to just be like, I guess I'm no longer welcome here, and then just choose to move.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and that's kind of isolating the church culture, but the church culture is lives in the midst of a larger culture that has shifted dramatically in the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, everything has changed. And I think there's a lot of fear because people are like ungrounded. They don't know, even in the church. I mean, yes, they've got the church culture that they can hold on to, but there's the culture that surrounds them is so aggressive that tends to dictate the way we live our lives. Yeah. More than the church dictates the way we live our lives. Yeah. So there's that. I mean, as a pastor, you kind of look at the whole thing and go, I'm overwhelmed, overworked, no time, not enough resources. I don't know what to do with any of this. Yeah.
And I have a question for you, I guess, as a pastor, right? Like, how do you think, like, churches can be, I don't know, like a faithful presence in the midst of the broader culture, right? Of America, of American society, of American politics, and all these things, right? I think when most people think of Christians showing up in those spaces, it's mostly as a reactionary presence, right? As if that's the only way, right? Like that we're just against everything else that isn't the church, right? And what the church is against is going to look different place to place. But I'm wondering if there's a healthier model where it isn't simply as a reactionary, reactive presence.
Well, I think you guys hit it in the core group that you pulled together. I think it goes back to discipleship. I think most of the problems that we wrestle with in the church culture stem from a shallow relationship with God. And so if the pastors had time and energy and resources enough to solely focus on taking people deeper, I mean, that's what John Mark is kind of doing with Practicing the Way right now. The key to all this is the depth of your relationship with God and trying to figure out ways to go deeper there so that you have the integrity and the principles and the values that create that resiliency. I think that they're, in a lot of ways, they're missing. We've allowed such a shallow relationship with God in churches. I know this is a really hard thing to do. You know, I spent a lot of time trying to encourage people, trying to figure out ways to help people go deeper in their relationship with God. But the battle is real. Yeah, the battle for time, the battle for your attention. So I think the key is discipleship. I think it's just what you guys started out with. If we could somehow find a way to bring maturity to the church and their depth of relationship with God, it would change the way we respond to the culture.
Would you say that kind of I guess it's a human proclivity to kind of just fall back on my tribe, right, and allow divisiveness to happen. Do you think, right, like that the church can be better than that, right? That if you're, to use your language, like spiritual maturity may be to be in a place where you're like, no, I don't want divisiveness to exist, right? That if there is a division, my Christian calling is to be the bridge builder in that moment. Okay.
Well, I think the church expects comfort.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
And so most of spiritual growth happens because you get uncomfortable. You know, it's doing hard things. And the church, if we could become more willing to do hard things and be uncomfortable and do messy church and be okay with it, and not, like figure out ways we're going to clean up all the messes before they even happen. Yeah, I think that we'd find growth happening. We really would.
I think I shared with you off air that I just came from San Antonio from a conference. And at that conference, one of the speakers said something that I think I'm still kind of mulling on, and I'm going to probably come back to this time and time again for the next several months, because I thought it was very compelling, convicting, challenging, and very insightful. She said, and this is Dr. Karen Finch. She's a PCUSA, a pastor, or not a pastor. She's a professor, but she's a member of the PCUSA church. And she said, we have this false pretense that division just happens, that it's just a part of life, right? That, of course, you're going to fall in and out of relationships, right? And so when divisions happen, we just kind of lean on that crutch of like, oh, this is just part of life.
Yeah. And
I immediately was like, whoa, if that's a false pretense, then what are the implications for me? Now I'm speaking just as, not an ICRD head, but like as a Christian, like what are the implications of what responsibility do I have, right? Yeah. In light of that, right? If that is a false pretense, and if division just doesn't happen, and if division, perhaps to use her language, right, even more forcefully, is because of our sinful nature, right? And that every division is an opportunity for repentance.
Oh, that's good.
Right?
Yeah.
And she even linked it back to kind of like how Christ in his salvific work bridged the biggest divide in his whole humanity, whole divinity. In that moment on the cross, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah.
That rupture was bridged in that moment.
Yeah.
So the biggest divide you could possibly think of, Christ solved it already.
Yeah.
How can we then, as followers of Christ, allow for any kind of division to stand in the way in our earthly life then?
Yeah.
Right? And should we not be kind of leaning on Christ for that salvific work to happen in any divided relationship as we approach it with first repentance and realizing that the bridge building work is actually our faith being lived out?
Yeah.
Right? That we
That's
have
perfect.
faith in that kind of redemptive power of what happened on the cross in these little micro moments in our lives. And I was like, I'm still like wrestling
You know what's so
with it.
good
Yeah.
about that is that it's like it ignores the 3-step process to fix the problem.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to the ancient solution, which is always repentance, forgiveness, and love. You know, you're right. You're absolutely right. The church has a treasure chest at the center of who they are that they're not tapping into. That's good. That's really good, right? Yeah. Well, I just want to talk a little bit about where you see things going. Where's ICRM going, do you think? Where are you going? What interests you that isn't happening yet?
Oh, so my hopes and aspirations for our work in Portland. Let's start with our work in Portland, and then I can kind of go more meta.
Yeah.
Our work in Portland would be like, and I think we've set it up so that this can happen, right? That there is a kind of a critical mass currently of people who are interested, not just interested, but invested into building bridges and being more united, not uniformity, but unity, right?
Yeah.
Unity in distinction, right? Understanding that, yeah, we're all bringing our biases, our leanings, our preferences, our opinions to the table, but still under one banner kind of thing, right? I think there's enough of that right now happening in the churches in the Tri-County area, Portland, where now I think the next step would be to start building bridges with other sectors of society, the public health sector.
Okay, before you get there,
Yeah.
does a bridge need to be built between male and female? There's a lot of Hispanic churches in this area. There's a lot of Korean churches in this area. There's a lot of Russian churches in this area, Ukrainian churches in this area. Do those bridges need to be built before that happens?
So I think they can happen in tandem, right? So I think you're talking on the one hand, ecumenical bridges being built across different denominations, different churches, and things like that. Absolutely, and also across different religious traditions. Absolutely, we're all for kind of building interreligious coalitions, right? Because the more faith leaders show up, the better in general.
Yeah,
right?
the question I have is, how does unfractured not become an echo chamber in itself? Everybody that comes kind of looks the same, talks the same, feels the same.
Great point.
Because the diversity is hard to get in Christian circles.
Yes. And that is kind of, I guess that's to use a more philosophical, a dialectic, right? It's kind of like we go out, we come in, we go out again, we come in again, we go out again, and we come in again. And it's going to have to be this dynamic process where...
Oh, good.
Right. And I think while we have this momentum, and there is a history in Portland where I think Rick was very central to this. Rick and I believe Kevin Palau of the Palau Association, they two were I'm surprised like this isn't a story more widely known, but then like when the first gay mayor, Portland, right, Sam Adams, I believe is his name, right, like when he was elected, like Rick and Kevin like kind of organized evangelical leaders to kind of show up and say like, hey, like we're here to help you, not get in your way, like regardless of what our stance on sexuality is and yours or whatever, like that, we're not here to debate that. We're just like, we want to help the city flourish. And let's start there. Like that you are a person of goodwill who has that in your heart. We are people of goodwill with that in our heart. Let's figure out a way to work, not just past our difference, but through our differences, right? And see what we can do. And that was like years and years ago. And unfortunately in our, political cycles, like, we've had so many different mayors and things like that. And those relationships, are really hard to maintain when there's such a turnover. Right. And so, but I'm like, so if there is a precedence for this, right, of churches in the Portland area reaching out to different sectors of society to build collaborative relationships, why not again, right? And this is absolutely the case in mainline Protestant circles, and Black churches in the Portland area have these relationships too in their own ways. And I think it's about like creating these. I mean, we're working primarily within the evangelical pocket of Portland, and so we'll start there because we're only one organization. We can't manage everything.
Well, yeah, I don't want to minimize what you've done, right? So, this is a big thing.
So we'll work where we are, and then we need to find friends who are working in these other spaces and try to see if we can coordinate better for sure. Because I know they exist. The work is happening. Like it's not happening elsewhere, but it's just a matter of finding co-conspirators, I guess.
Yeah. I remember I was at Imago Dei one time when Rick pulled in the leader of a coalition of Black churches in the area and just honored the guy. Yeah. You've been in this city for a long time. You've been fighting this battle for a long time. I just want you to know we're grateful for all the work that you've done. Totally. And that one act was a huge thing in the midst of what was happening in the Portland area. Yeah. Well, I mean, one more question. Mm-hmm. Are you hopeful?
I am.
You're young.
Yeah.
So, but are you hopeful about
for those who are watching, like 33, so young-ish, right? Yeah.
No, young.
Am I young? I don't know. Okay.
You're young.
Yeah. All right.
Are you hopeful about the future
in class? So I mean, like, I feel old when I'm with the 18-year-olds. Yeah. So okay.
Are you hopeful about the future?
I am hopeful. I know people like to disparage the youth and say, like, man, they're so lost, the burnout society, the anxious generation, or burnout, whatever. Yes, there's a lot of things that can be fixed. There's a lot of healing that needs to happen. But there's no shortage of passionate energy that is seeking, hungry, right? And I think that's important, that hasn't become nihilism or fatalism about like there's nothing to seek, right? So I still see that, and I as an educator who works with college age students right now, also, like, I want to do right by them as somebody who is older than them in the generation above. Like, how can I be good stewards of the things that I have control over, that I can steward over, and pass it and pay it forward, kind of, and just, I don't need to tell them life is hard or that the world sucks. Yeah. Like, they're going to learn that on their own. The world's doing a great job of telling them that. The news is doing a great job of telling them that. I'm trying to paint a picture of like what the world could be. Yeah. And not let these kids kind of forget that and forget to dream a little bit either. And it's getting harder and harder for sure. Yeah. But I am hopeful because, I have friends like you. I have friends that I've met in the Portland area, like Pastor Rick and Chris and Andy and Tim, right? All these great, amazing people who have such big hearts and it's not just good feelings. Like, they're doing the work, whether or not people see it, whether or not it's yielding fruit immediately, it's being done. And I know if this is my anecdotal small microcosm, I know it's also happening elsewhere too. Yeah. Longview, Seattle, like wherever in the world, I know it's happening. And so another reason why I'm hopeful is also because I think in our line of work, sometimes the conflicts are unsolvable, maybe intractable, I guess. Like when you look at Yemen, how it's been for the last like 15 plus years. When you look at Syria, it's still in shambles. We've been in those two countries doing peace building work, and yet for what? Yeah, people would say, like, don't you feel so like that everything's so futile? And yeah, you can feel that way for sure. Like, man, like no matter what we do, there's going to be greater geopolitical powers and shakers that move. And if the U.S. decides to drop bombs, they're going to drop bombs. They're not going to check in with ICRD, be like, hey, is this going to mess up your peace building work? No, they're just going to drop the bombs. But we have friends who live in those places, who are on the ground building peace every day.
Yeah.
And they haven't given up. So how
and
can we?
they're not talking to CNN.
No.
So you know them,
Yeah.
and the world doesn't know them yet.
Yeah. And so we're just like, dude, if you haven't given up, how could we? How can we lose hope when you haven't? You know. And so we're just like, we can't lose hope for them either. And so
I think the same thing is true in the church in general, the Big C Church. That there's, as a pastor, you can look at what's broken all the time and whine about the fact that it's not fixed yet, but you also know about Joanna Brown, who's in your church, working her tail off to be a mom to 5 girls that she doesn't know very well. And you know that, and the world doesn't know that. And there's things that you know just because of your experience, especially, I'm just thinking in the Portland area, you know the quality and the depth and the care and the love that these people have that are working really hard. The world doesn't know that yet.
Yep. And I think there's an element to making sure these stories are told and shared and more widely shared, right? Because sad stories, crisis stories, they make the news all the time.
Yeah, they float to the top.
Yeah, and so I think I'm like, well, maybe that's also part of the issue.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe we need to tell more stories of like the small W's every day that are happening. So
I think that's the unique blessing that podcasting is bringing to the world is you can have those conversations, especially long form podcasting is once you get past the niceties, you can really find out some powerful things that are going on in the United States that are really important. And so I have a lot of hope too, because of what's going on in that whole realm, and that we can sit down and have this conversation because of the work that you're doing. So thank you. And keep it up. Well done.
Thank you. Appreciate it.